We have Dr. Aaron Kheriaty back, one of the first people to ever get me suspended. Also, one of the people who got me fired from my day job. Why do I keep inviting you back, Dr.
I
Kheriaty?
know. I'm telling you, I'm dangerous. I'm radioactive. You hang around me too long, there's going to be trouble that follows you. So
We were just
I
talking.
have to initiate an apology, mea culpa, for ruining your.
No, you've launched me into obvious celebrity. I mean, come on. I'm losing hundreds of subscribers by the minute on YouTube. No, I'm just kidding. Actually, it is true on YouTube that things are not great, but otherwise things are awesome. We live on a farm now. I'm a full-time podcaster. We just picked up a shelter for the goats. Life is actually really good. So, you know what? It's just a lesson. And maybe you feel the same way because you went through your own professional changes due to all of this. I feel like I'm still living my best life. I don't know about you. And I could say that for encouragement to people who have gone through similar challenges like we have, that there can be light at the end of the tunnel.
Absolutely. I remember people telling me, you're going to look back on getting fired and say, this is the best thing that happened to you professionally. And I don't know that I'm quite there yet, but I'm getting pretty close to being able to make that claim. I certainly don't regret having gone through what I went through. And yeah, I mean, we've been blessed with all kinds of other really interesting opportunities since the university let me go. So, and the experience of censorship has taught me so much, being on the receiving end of that. And you mentioned that first interview that we did is actually important for what we're going to be talking about today, because you were one of the first, I think you were the first to do a video interview with me after I filed the lawsuit challenging the University of California's vaccine mandate in federal court. And that video was the first time that I was, at least knowingly, because you could be censored without realizing that you're being censored. Right. That was the first time that I realized that I was being censored, because they put a notice up there that, we don't like this video and we're taking it down. That was on YouTube. And the interesting thing about that, and you did appeal that decision and got it restored, but that experience of censorship was so eye-opening to me, because at that point, I wasn't criticizing or challenging the safety or efficacy of vaccines. I was making an ethical argument based on the doctrine of informed consent, a centerpiece of modern medical ethics, that vaccine mandates were unethical. I was making a public policy argument for a particular public policy. I wasn't criticizing a particular pharmaceutical product at that point. I now have more safety and efficacy concerns about those products than I did at that very first interview with you. As time went on and we saw the time-limited efficacy and we saw safety issues with the vaccines that had not been acknowledged early on. But at that time, it was simply an argument about ethics. It was a philosophical argument. And to have a video like that, to have an interview like that pulled down and censored, just seemed completely bizarre and dystopian, even if it was for a short period of time. And what ended up happening, of course, is now I'm in a situation in which I'm challenging the censorship that was happening on social media companies, because I and my fellow plaintiffs in this lawsuit called Missouri v. Biden are alleging that it wasn't just private companies doing this. This wasn't just a decision made by YouTube or the executives at Google, which owns YouTube. This was something that in many cases was coming from the federal government. The federal government was leaning on and pressuring and colluding with and threatening social media companies if they did not comply with specific censorship requests. So that's that, I think, now well-established fact, based on the evidence that we submitted, is at the centerpiece of this case. And when I submitted my own written evidence, my own declaration, the first instance I cited of being censored was the conversation that you and I had that was pulled from YouTube. Yeah. So so that interview where we first met is now part of the permanent record in this case that I think will turn out to be a landmark legal First Amendment case, really one of the most important free speech cases of our generation, arguably.
That is so cool. I had no idea. Well, I'll write my old boss and tell her, see, shouldn't have fired me because now I can talk freely.
Exactly. Maybe you could get some restitution. Yeah.
Yeah, she's running for governor now in Washington State, so that's a whole
Oh
whole
boy.
new. Yeah. Well, okay, let's watch this little reaction to the lawsuit. And yeah, since you mentioned it, again, it's a lawsuit that has been making the news rounds. There are a lot of First Amendment lawsuits, right, against the Biden administration right now, but this one has made headlines because you all had success in it, and we'll talk about what the judge's decision was. But of course, and everyone's, there's just all kinds of like hysteria from certain news outlets talking about how like we just don't want to live in a world where this, this decision exists, where the government can't pressure social media companies to censor speech. Like, God help us, one CNN commentator said. I was just laughing. Like it's like they never take into account the mistakes the government makes, like the lives that have been lost. The freedoms that have been lost. Like it's just like, no, the daddy government is here to help us. They never get it wrong. They never use their power for political motives. It's all great. How could we live in this world? So let's just watch Robbie over at The Hill go through some of it.
New Post and the New York Times, whose reports included quotations from internet security experts fretting about the federal government's diminished ability to police speech online. Guests on CNN and MSNBC took an even more apocalyptic tone. CNN legal analyst Eli Honig assailed the, quote, aggressive, far-reaching ruling, while NBC News reporter Ryan Riley described a world free of federal pressure on social media platforms as one that, quote, we wouldn't want to live in. Riley also fundamentally underappreciated the scope of the pressure campaign, telling MSNBC viewers that, quote, it's not as though the FBI has been going in and saying, hey, take down that post. No, seriously. Let's watch what he said.
Through kind of the parameters of this injunction.
Yeah, I mean, so it basically has some limits on what exactly the FBI, I think, most essentially is able to do. And I think that, you have to take a step back and acknowledge what the reality is about how the FBI has been interacting with this. And just look at January 6th itself, for example, right? It's not as though the FBI has been going in and saying, hey, take down this post, hey, take down this post. That's what they're alleging, but there's just not a lot of evidence to support that. And basically, we've had a situation where some politicians are making any contact between social media companies and the FBI or law enforcement seem problematic in some way.
Yeah. Okay.
Dial pads, AI sales.
To me, that's totally nuts that you have somebody who is saying that it's not like the government's directly pressuring these tech companies, whether it's the FBI or the CDC or the Biden administration specifically, because that what came out in your lawsuit is that actually, in fact, and we've seen with the Twitter files and other reports that that's in fact exactly what's going on. And that's something that we all knew, like, had to have been going on. Those of us who have been experiences, like, we had the symptoms of it. We just hadn't gotten to the root cause of the disease yet. But we knew that there was something beyond just the tech companies and money going on there.
That's exactly right. The government was pressuring very clearly. So this comment was from a man either who's being dishonest, and I want to give him credit. I don't think perhaps you could say he's not lying, but in that case, he hasn't actually read the record. He hasn't actually looked at the mountains of evidence that we presented to the court showing that that is exactly what is happening. His misrepresentation also mischaracterizes the nature of state action and the way in which it can cause First Amendment problems. So the courts have made it clear that overt pressure or overt threats of regulation or threats of removing Section 230 immunity and things of that nature, those are just one way in which the state might be implicated in unconstitutional, unlawful censorship. The court has articulated 4 other ways besides pressure or coercion that includes various types of entanglements, that includes just getting too involved in some of those conversations and some of those decisions. And the reason why even that is problematic from a First Amendment standpoint is the clear asymmetry of power between the government and social media companies. So, a boxer's glove, fists can be considered deadly weapons, even if he never uses them, even if he never, pulls his fists up and threatens to punch you. Just knowing that, a person like that is capable of doing something like that, just knowing that the government carries this stick behind it when it's making these quote unquote requests, puts the social media companies in an impossible situation where they feel like they have to comply. Otherwise, the government can make life very, very difficult for them. The social media companies could not function, could not exist without Section 230 immunity liability protection. And the government has not only covertly or subtly suggested that that could be on the table if they don't comply, it has in many instances that we've clearly documented to the court overtly threatened to remove that liability, like spoken the words out loud. And so we've documented not only the pressure and coercion, but even if that wasn't in place, this commentator would be mistaken, thinking that it's okay for the government to meet regularly with social media companies and flag posts and tell them, hey, we really think you should take a look at this, and we really think this ought to be removed. Even that level of entanglement with censorship activities violates the First Amendment. The language of the First Amendment says that the government shall not abridge the freedom of speech. The word abridge is very important, and the courts have interpreted that very clearly to mean anything that reduces the ability of citizens to be heard. Anything the government does to reduce that is a violation of the First Amendment. Private actors, private companies can engage in various censorship-related activities, arguably, but the government cannot. And that's exactly what the government has been doing on a scale that's hard for most Americans to fully appreciate. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of Americans being censored tens of millions of times. We're talking about the government not only saying, you know, you might want to take a look at these posts and see if they violate your terms of service, but also saying, well, if they don't violate your terms of service, we think they're problematic, and you may want to consider, nudge, nudge, hint, hint, changing your terms of service so that these posts do violate your terms of service. And the social media companies scrambling to comply in just that way, changing their terms of service and subsequently punishing thousands of Americans by de-amplifying their ability to speak.
I want to read a section of the decision at the end. I also want to ask you about Tampered over here on the live chat on my locals page. Allison, did you read the district court saying staying the injunction, Biden administration and rest of government free to collude again? So we got to talk about that too.
Well, I'll give you all the legal updates on those
right.
back and forth subtleties. It can get a little confusing.
Okay, good. Let me push some wine real fast because you know you need a drink when you listen to Dr. Kheriaty talk about how awful things are on the internet. And actually, really, the reason yeah, you can go join my editorial board too at AllisonMorrow.locals.com. But if you want the wine, go to AllisonWinePromo.com. Dr. Kheriaty just told you that the Allison Morrow Show is in the lawsuit. Come on. What other reason do you need to go to AllisonWinePromo.com and toast to your participation in what's going on this channel? Dr. Kheriaty is here telling us we're making history, people. So get some wine to celebrate. Extremist altitude wine. My son is too young to drink. He's only 10 months old. But he's telling you too in the background in the way he can that you should go buy some AllisonWinePromo.com. You get 50% off the wine and 50% off shipping. If you drink too much of it, the next day you're probably going to need some coffee. So go to twinenginecoffee.com/Allison. These are USDA certified organic roast, light roast, dark roast, espresso roast. I'm trying to out-talk my son right now.
I love it.
Who he gets it from.
Keeping it real.
There's also tea, if you're a tea drinker, tea that you make from the fruit around the coffee bean. It's all very good. I also have a couple affiliate partnerships I'm working with right now. Their links are all in the description. So if like you're into hydroponics, I just signed in a hydroponic. If you want one of those systems, you want to grow you can grow pot if you want. I don't care. They say it's for gardens. I'm not asking any questions, but anyway, you can do that. Or if you are a glasses wearer, I have like one of the best glass companies ever, betterspectacles.com. You can go to them too. We're working on them as well. So anyway, thank you for those of you who go to support my sponsors. They really do help keep me in business. And again, keep people like Dr. Kheriaty coming on. And they haven't left me yet. Even as much as trouble as he's gotten me into, they haven't left me. Okay, so this says, the plaintiffs are likely to succeed on the merits in establishing the government has used its power to silence the opposition. Opposition to COVID-19 vaccines, opposition to COVID-19 masking and lockdowns, opposition to the lab leak theory of COVID-19, opposition to the validity of the 2020 election, opposition to President Biden's policies, statements that the Hunter Biden laptop story was true, opposition to policies that the government officials in power all were suppressed. It is quite telling that each example or category of suppressed speech was conservative in nature. The targeted suppression of conservative ideas is a perfect example of viewpoint discrimination of political speech. American citizens have the right to engage in free debate about the significant issues affecting the country. Although this case is still relatively young, and at this stage the court is only examining it in terms of plaintiffs' likelihood of success on the merits, the evidence produced thus far depicts an almost dystopian scenario. During the COVID-19 pandemic, a period perhaps best characterized by widespread doubt and uncertainty, the United States government seems to have assumed a role similar to an Orwellian ministry of truth. So it's some pretty strong words from him. Yeah. Let's go to what this person's saying though. What's the latest with the case?
Okay, so the district court judge in the ruling that you just read from issued what's called a preliminary injunction. A preliminary injunction is not a final ruling in the case. Preliminary injunction is actually very difficult to get. There's a high legal threshold that the plaintiffs have to meet. Basically, it's the plaintiffs saying, before the case goes to trial, just on the basis of the written evidence that we've initially submitted, on the basis of limited discovery that the court has allowed so far, we think we're presenting enough evidence that what we're alleging is happening and that it's so harmful that it needs to be stopped immediately. We don't even want the court to wait for a final ruling in the case to step in and tell the government, you can't continue to do this. You cannot continue to censor protected speech. And the judge agreed with us. So we petitioned the court saying, we want you to step in now at this very early stage of the case and put a stop to what's happening. And the judge agreed. And that's the decision that you just read from, is the judge telling the government, you cannot do this anymore while this case is being tried. The government came back 2 days later and appealed that injunction decision to the Fifth Circuit. So there's three levels in a federal court. There's the district court, where we're at now. There's the circuit court, in this case, the Fifth Circuit. And then above that is the Supreme Court. The government also asked for what's called a stay, meaning don't implement this injunction until we go through the appeal at the Fifth Circuit. And they asked the district court judge for a stay. He said no. But then they asked the Fifth Circuit for a stay, and the Fifth Circuit said yes on the stay. So that's basically the Fifth Circuit saying that we haven't heard the appeal yet, but while we're waiting a couple of weeks to do the appeal, the injunction is not going to be in effect. So the Fifth Circuit has not overturned the injunction. That's not what this means. The Fifth Circuit has just said, we're hitting the pause button on implementing the injunction until we make a ruling on appeal. Okay. So that ruling should come in a couple of weeks. And they will either uphold the injunction or they will strike down the injunction or deny it, or they may modify it in some way. Maybe the language in it wasn't clear enough. And so they'll send it back and say, well, okay, clarify what is and is not permissible, with a little bit more detail or something like that. Even if the injunction gets struck down, that doesn't mean that we lose this case. That just means that, we haven't passed that high bar necessary for the court to intervene this early on. Whatever happens with the injunction, the case will then proceed to the trial phase. And in the trial phase, hey, little man.
He's here. He was like, I got to ask him a question.
Yeah.
That's Jack.
Okay, you look like a future lawyer. So we're going to do a little law school one-on-one here. Most observers of this case believe that this case will ultimately end up in the Supreme Court for a final ruling. And the courts grind slowly. So that could take probably a couple of years to get through that entire process, especially since the government is fighting us every inch of the way, even on kind of routine aspects of depositions and discovery and so forth. So this case is going to grind slowly, but ultimately it's likely to end up at the Supreme Court because both sides are going to appeal the decision all the way up if we don't get a favorable ruling.
Yeah.
Given the fact that that will take a while, we really want the district court to uphold this injunction so that we could put a stop to it without waiting months to, a year or two for a final ruling. We want this to stop now. But even if we don't get that, we're going to continue to fight until this censorship regime is dismantled. I think that's important for people to understand and not get confused by the back and forth in the press, which can suggest that, a final ruling has been made or a final ruling has been overturned or whatever. That's not, in fact, what is going on. And, sometimes those legal subtleties and distinctions can get lost in the noise of, the heated debate about this case.
Yeah. I'll tell you what, watching the reactions to it has really opened my eyes to how we have such a divided public on this issue. Because, okay, Jack wants to talk again. If you listen to those people long enough, I could see how people, if that's all you're hearing, is that, like, even one guy I heard said, now, like, traffic department won't be able to tell us about the weather. Like, that's what this is about. Like, they won't even be able to tell us about the weather anymore on their social media. It's like, that's not what.
No, this is crazy. The government can say whatever it wants on its own social media feeds. The government can put out whatever press releases it wants. It can have however many press conferences it wants. It can blast out all the information that it thinks is best to the public as much as it wants. This injunction does not stop any of that. Right. What this injunction stops is the government meeting privately behind closed doors with social media companies and pressuring them to abridge or to censor the speech of other Americans. This is stopping the government from taking down your speech or your neighbor's speech. This is not stopping the government themselves from speaking. People have also claimed wrongly that this injunction will prevent law enforcement from asking social media for help flagging certain things, that it will prevent the government from, basically taking down things like child pornography. That is also not true. The First Amendment is not absolute. The courts over time have articulated some things that are not protected speech. Obscenity is not protected speech. Child pornography is not protected speech. Direct incitement to physical violence is not protected speech. All of these things have been articulated by the courts over the years. They're clearly defined in the law. And in the injunction, the judge makes a point of spelling out all the things that this injunction does not apply to, all the things that I just mentioned, and a few other narrowly defined exceptions to First Amendment protections. The only thing that the government cannot do is violate the First Amendment. The only thing the government cannot do is censor other people. This is not turning down the volume on the government's own microphone to say whatever it wants to the American public at all. That's either a grossly ignorant misrepresentation or a deliberate misrepresentation of what the injunction actually does.
I think that's what this was about. But okay, Dr. Kheriaty, got a bunch of questions for you over on Locals. $5 a month, alicetomorrow.locals.com. You can go one-on-one with the most censored people on the internet. And before I do that, where can people follow and find you if they want to keep up with what you're doing?
So I'm on Twitter at Kheriaty. You can follow my Substack called Human Flourishing, aaronkheriaty.substack.com. Those are the two places where I'm posting frequently updates on this case. I have a recent piece in the Federalist that just came out a couple of days ago on this case. I had a piece last week in Tablet Magazine. You can Google both of those. Those will kind of quickly get you up to speed on the arguments and the key issues in this case. So those are a couple of resources that folks will hopefully find helpful.
Awesome. Okay, Plot Girl 7, does Dr. Kheriaty think the Supreme Court will rule as strongly in his favor as the Missouri judge did if the case gets to them?
I do. I think we're going to prevail in this case because ultimately the legal questions are not that complicated. And the evidence that we have is so overwhelming, not only that this is happening, but that it's happening on a massive scale, that I don't see how any court, whether it's, more liberal leaning judges or more conservative leaning judges will ultimately come down on the side of the government on this one. Free speech is a fundamental right. It's a constitutional right. That means the court has to apply the highest level of scrutiny to the government's behavior, what's called a strict scrutiny standard. It means that the burden of proof really is on the government to show that everything that they did was legal and that the only kind of speech that they tried to censor were those few narrowly defined exceptions in the law that the First Amendment does not cover, things like obscenity or direct incitement to physical violence. And it's absolutely clear from the evidentiary record that we've submitted, and there's going to be more evidence as the case proceeds. We've been granted what's called limited discovery, but there's going to be more subpoenas for more communications between government and social media. There's going to be more depositions of the people involved. There's going to be more evidence. But even on the basis of the evidence we have so far, the district court judge correctly said this evidence is so overwhelming that this may be one of the most important free speech cases in U.S. history. And the violations, if what the plaintiffs allege is true, the violations to First Amendment rights are the worst in the United States history. You rarely see it. Judges are careful, they're circumspect. They usually do not make grandiose statements like this in a court decision. But I think Judge Doughty rightly recognized that this is a case where the government's own violations were so egregious and our evidence so overwhelming that, as he said, we're likely to prevail on the merits even before we get into the adversarial, trial process of examination and cross-examination and fact-finding and so forth. So I do ultimately think we're going to prevail in this case.
Okay, next question. And Dr. Kheriaty, if by chance my internet bugs out and I get booted out of the show for 30 seconds, just answer the question and I'll be right back, okay?
Yeah.
All right.
You're looking at my belly here because I'm trying to improve my lighting. I have some weird
Oh, don't worry about it.
Sunlight
yeah, it looks
this
like you're
time
in
of day.
federal prison, so
I know, it's stripes.
some people probably think you should be, I'm sure, that hate my
Yeah.
channel.
Yeah, there's
That's why I tell people to buy my wine, because they can be an extremist because it's such high altitude. I call it extremist altitude wine. So you can be an extremist without going to federal prison. That's always my pitch. All right. Welcome back and applause for continuing your struggle, Dr. Kheriaty. It's my understanding the murmurs of shadow banning had been swirling for years before Biden administration took office. When will the personal lawsuits in civil court begin?
Yeah.
Do you think to attack like plea bargains, sue weaker, poor foot soldiers to sign settlements so they testify against more powerful people?
Yeah, great questions. So this case, and I think this preliminary injunction ruling, which is 155 pages long and summarizes a lot of the evidence in the case. So it's helpful in that regard. It's now part of the federal court's record, does open the breach for a lot more lawsuits on behalf of other individuals who have been sued by social media. We are also petitioning the court to convert this case to a class action lawsuit. So this case, Missouri v. Biden, was filed by 2 states, Missouri and Louisiana, and 5 private plaintiffs. I'm one of those private plaintiffs. But what we're asking the court is to allow those private plaintiffs basically not only to represent ourselves, but if the court agrees that this could be a class action suit, that means I am representing anyone who's been censored by the government or under pressure from the government on social media, which I consider a grave responsibility to do that for all my fellow Americans who, don't have the means or the opportunity or the wherewithal to take their case to court. And I'm hoping that this case will also set a precedent that will allow other individuals to basically get restitution for the harms that the censorship did to them professionally, financially, in terms of their health, perhaps, because a lot of the censorship was around scientific opinions on what is best to do during COVID. Those are the reasons that I and Jay Bhattacharya and Martin Kulldorff, 2 of my co-plaintiffs, were censored around public health related issues. So The other thing that I think is going to hopefully open up a breach in the wall, there's a very important, and you could easily miss it if you don't have the sort of legal expertise to spot it, but on page 100 of this 155-page decision, the judge sort of suggests that the social media companies themselves are not without liability or responsibility, that if they allow themselves to get entangled with the government in this way, then basically they could be held to account and potentially legally liable for First Amendment violations as well. I think the social media companies want the government off their back, truth be told. I think they're quietly cheering the plaintiffs in this case because they don't want to be told what to do. And there were instances that we presented in the record where the social media companies actually tried to push back, and then they got further bullied and harassed and kind of abused whenever they tried to push back. But there were some instances of them trying to push back against the government pressure. And so I think they want us to prevail. And they should also be aware that if they don't learn to separate themselves and to push back against government interference, they could potentially be held liable. So I could foresee cases on behalf of censored individuals, not only aimed at the federal government who is doing this, but also at the social media companies who were cooperating and collaborating and doing the bidding of the federal government in this regard. So, this should not and cannot be the last free speech case. I'm hoping it will set a very strong precedent at the Supreme Court, but also, open a breach in the wall for others to run through so that we can piece by piece dismantle this censorship regime, what Michael Schellenberger has called the censorship industrial complex, this whole network of public agencies. There's at least a dozen public agencies involved in this, named as defendants in the case, but also these, what I call quasi-private entities. I call them quasi-private because they're think tanks at universities, like the Stanford Internet Observatory. University of Washington has a place that's involved in government censorship, and other nonprofits like the Virality Project, the Atlantic Council. I call them quasi-private because a lot of them rely on government funding and government grants. And there's also a revolving door of personnel that tend to move from these government agencies into these quasi-private entities and back. So it's a small coterie of people moving from government to sort of the censorship industry piece of it and back that are involved in this. And that whole network, that whole Leviathan has to be taken apart piece by piece. And all of the players need to be held accountable for violations of the First Amendment. The government cannot outsource, to these quasi-private entities what it's not allowed to do itself. The courts have made that clear. It's like, if I hire a hitman and I say, well, I didn't kill the guy. So the hitman is now partially responsible, but I'm still also responsible for that.
I hadn't heard that analogy before, but that's kind of interesting. I'm glad that I'm not the only one that scratches her head about the Stanford Internet Observatory. Everything I've written or read that's come out of there, I'm like, what are they thinking? Anyway, okay, Wayne, can Dr. Kheriaty offer some words of hope? And by the way, KM, I'm skipping your question about eugenics just for a second because I want to make sure we get through everybody's questions about this topic before my kids stage a mutiny on me. So can Dr. Kheriaty offer some words of hope inside the battle for someone outside who now believes that the three-letter agencies have so thoroughly taken over the government and the media and other relevant industries, especially military, that there is no going back to free choice any longer? When I see all the Ds in Congress pontificating this week that government censure of social media is just fine, I give up. They obviously have no respect for the Congress shall pass no law, words they pledge an oath to defend and protect. Words of hope, I think that's the main question.
So, on my pessimistic days, I will say this is a really, really hard problem. The administrative state, what some have called the deep state, this whole vast enterprise of 434 federal agencies there are, by the way, in the Federal Register. Well-informed Americans who are paying attention could maybe name a dozen agencies, the CDC, the FBI, the CIA, the NIH, whatever. But yeah, 434 federal agencies, this vast enterprise of unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats who, through rulemaking processes and through engaging with social media companies behind closed doors and so forth, are shaping our lives in profound ways. This is a really, really hard problem to know what to do about, especially when Congress is so weak and one side of the aisle seems very, very weak shockingly, on First Amendment free speech. I mean, the Dems used to be the party of free speech, defending even vile speech, which one has to do. We don't defend vile speech. We don't defend the Nazis or neo-Nazis marching through Skokie, Illinois, because we like Nazis or neo-Nazis. We defend vile speech because the only alternative is giving some individual or some group of individuals or the government power to decide what is true and what is false, which is totalitarian. Basically, that's what totalitarian regimes do. They monopolize what counts as knowledge. They monopolize what counts as rationality. So better to let both good and bad ideas have free play and have enough respect for the American people that we believe the vast majority of American people will recognize that the Nazis' ideology is vile and reject it out of hand. And yet now we see many, many people on the left, sad to say, that used to defend free speech very, very strongly, saying that, you know, to solve the problem of disinformation or misinformation, the government has to intervene. At the same time, I see a lot of my friends who are on the left or formerly on the left who are now recognizing that that party is generally moving in the wrong direction. I mean, think most of the Twitter Files journalists, from my friend Michael Schellenberger to Matt Taibbi to Barry Weiss, were all liberal progressive journalists, you know, standard sort of left of center journalists who really maintained their commitment to the First Amendment and to free speech and to liberalism when the rest of their parties started moving in a more authoritarian direction. I think there's a lot of politically homeless people now on the left who, you know, may not be as loud as some of the other voices, but they're definitely out there and they're definitely concerned about the direction that things are going. And so politically independent, sort of politically homeless, left of center or right of center folks that are now coming together and recognizing that we may disagree on certain issues, but we still want to uphold the Constitution. We still want to uphold things like free speech and religious freedom and freedom of association, even during a public health emergency. So that's encouraging. I think that I think political alignments are shifting right now, and standard left-right divisions don't necessarily apply to what's happening with the voter base. So it'll be, you know, it'll be interesting to see how things shake out in the next election and in the future. How many of these censorship enthusiasts in Congress will get voted out of office in favor of people either from the same or a different party that want to uphold the Constitution. So if you look back at American history, there have been some dark spells and some dark points, but we tend to have this ability to renew and rejuvenate the American project when it looks like it's on life support. So I'm hopeful that we can do that again. We got to win in the court of public opinion, though. We got, you know, we have to explain to people what's going on very clearly and try to help them understand that this is important for all of us. It's not a left-right issue. It's a legal versus illegal issue. The only question is whether the federal government has systematically violated the highest law of the land, which is the United States Constitution. I think the answer is yes. That's why I'm fighting in this case. I think anyone who objectively looks at the evidence that we've presented to the court will come to the same conclusion, regardless of, you know, whether they lean more liberal or more conservative.
Hey, by the way, somebody was asking if you're still practicing in California or did you have to move?
I am practicing in California. I have a small private practice in Orange County. And yeah, so I'm seeing patients here. I'm connected with some independent think tanks, the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and the Brownstone Institute, the Zephyr Institute here in California have all supported me in my research and public policy work. So yeah, I'm still in California making trouble here.
Oh my gosh, my son is like trying to take over the show. I don't know if you saw, like at one
You should
point,
give him the mic.
At one point he like made the web page full screen and like removed you from the podcast, and I'd like put you back in because he's just banging on the table and he's just hitting all these buttons. All right, I'm going to try to get to a couple more questions before we have to wrap this. Did he see that we have helped Ukraine block speech? Does he think this is the new method to work around a judge's order? And, you know, Dr. Kheriaty, one thing I wanted to mention is it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy, or just like a cycle that feeds itself, because as these judges become more and more, I think, politically motivated and speech is censored, it's like they don't even have the information themselves in the judiciary, right? Because they're not getting the information. And so it's like they're deciding on cases they don't even really understand, or at least they have a bias based on the exact thing they're supposed to be deciding about. So it's just fascinating to me how that all goes down.
Here's what happened with Ukraine. And by the way, it's not a workaround. It's another piece of evidence that we now have to present to the court. The Ukrainian intelligence service, basically the Ukrainian version of the CIA, reached out to the FBI, asking the FBI to lean on social media companies, as they have been doing regularly and routinely, to remove posts that the Ukrainian intelligence agency claimed was, you know, Russian disinformation. Some of it might have been sourced out of Russia. And by the way, the federal government, non-US citizens are not protected by the First Amendment. So for better or worse, the federal government can do more to censor information coming from outside of the US or from non-US citizens abroad than it can do to its own population. But in this case, the evidence clearly showed that when the FBI pressured social media companies in this regard and forwarded basically the information from the Ukrainians to the social media companies, many of the people who were censored not only were not like Russian agents, but they were American citizens. One of them, I think, worked for, I want to say the State Department, don't quote me on that, but worked for a government agency. And that is another clear violation of the First Amendment. It's particularly disgusting because it's basically our government not only doing the censoring, but allowing a foreign intelligence service, a foreign government that's currently at war, to censor Americans. So that is not a workaround. That's another piece of evidence that will be presented to the court that Americans' rights have been systematically violated. We now know, not just by our own government, but by our own government at the behest of the Ukrainian intelligence service. So to bracket for a moment your views on the war in Ukraine and so on and so forth, another clear violation of Americans' First Amendment free speech rights. And this is very characteristic of what the government agencies have been doing. They stopped trying to distinguish between foreign and domestic actors, and they just said, we're going to censor everybody. Well, when you do that to Americans, you're engaged in illegal activity. You're engaged in unconstitutional activity. So, yeah, it's terrible that it happened, but it's good that it came out, because it's piling more evidence on top of an already fairly large pile of evidence that it's become impossible to deny, which is why you see a lot of the defenders of the censorship regime shifting gears now. Right, a month or two ago, it was, oh, no, this stuff is not happening. This is conspiracy theory, secret meetings between FBI or the Homeland Security or the NIH and, you know, social media companies. That's just, you know, whatever, right-wing propaganda, conspiracy theory. They're not saying that anymore because it's just impossible to say that in the face of the publicly available evidence. Now they're saying, well, yeah, it was happening, and you know, it's a good thing that it was happening because we need the government to protect us from bad ideas or from wrong-headed people. So they've pivoted, which is a clear admission that just flat-out denial of these egregious violations is no longer tenable. It's just impossible to believe for anyone who's taken even a cursory look at the evidence from the Twitter files or the evidence from Missouri v. Biden.
Okay. All right. He's trying to yank out my headphones. So let's see if I can make it through this one. Thank you for the work he did for freedom of speech, exposing how this works between the agencies and corporations. When companies are not challenging the approaches or pushed by agencies to alter the truth or silence the truth or freedom of speech, does this make the companies complicit in censorship? I think you answered that yes. That's what you're thinking. And the corporations to be held liable for financial damages. Censorship does have physical harm upon the public by unusual means of economic damages upon our society. It leads to physical harm when a few million is hardly a drop in the bucket to the agencies and the corporations. What incentive can be instilled in the personnel's hearts of the agencies and corporations to ensure this does not happen anymore?
Yeah. Great questions. Yes. And without getting into all the legal subtleties, the corporations potentially could be liable, depending on exactly what kind of collaboration you're able to establish. That's number one. Number two, we see what can happen when one owner of one corporation is committed to free speech. Elon Musk has had a huge impact, and the Twitter files have had a huge impact on this whole issue. And whatever else you think of Elon and his adventures or his pursuits, I think he is sincere about free speech. He told Bill Maher recently that there's a lot easier ways to make money than by buying a company like Twitter and trying to be mayor of Tweetown. I think he's doing it because he sincerely wants there to be a public platform where divergent and diverse viewpoints are featured in order to allow Americans to make informed decisions. The Supreme Court has made it clear that censorship harms not just the person speaking, right? You may think, well, I'm only on social media to read what other people say. I don't post a lot. I don't think I have personally been censored. So I guess I haven't been harmed by this whole thing. No, that's not true. The courts have made it clear that whenever censorship is happening, not only is the person speaking being harmed, but the listeners are being harmed as well. Because how can you make an informed decision if you're only allowed to hear one side of a contested or a debated issue? Right? So censorship harms all Americans, regardless of whether they're putting their own viewpoint or their own information out there on social media. The thing that ultimately needs to happen, I think, is that Congress needs to pass laws that will treat social media companies like common carriers. A common carrier is something like a telephone line or a conduit of information. An internet service provider would be another example of a common carrier, where that service provider has to stay neutral. Right? Your internet service provider, your AT&T or your Comcast or your Cox or whatever, shouldn't be able to intervene and decide what information can and cannot go through their fiber optic cables into your home or into your computer. Aside from, again, things that are not constitutionally protected, child pornography and so forth. Now, social media companies got carved out a kind of weird privilege, actually, where they said, well, we don't want to be responsible for everything that is published on our platforms, because that would be impossible to police everything, right? A newspaper or a magazine, a traditional publisher can be liable if they print libel, if they print slander. You could take them to court and say, you printed this thing that was knowingly false and it harmed me, and now you're legally liable for that. Social media companies obviously didn't want that kind of responsibility. But at the same time, they wanted the ability to censor, to decide what can and cannot be placed on this platform, and to have terms of service that would allow them to remove users. So they sort of want to have their cake and eat it too. And my own view is you got to pick one side or the other. Either you're a publisher, in which case you could censor all you want, right? A book publisher doesn't have to publish this book if they don't want to. They don't have to publish that other book if they don't want to. A newspaper doesn't have to print your letter to the editor if they don't want to. They can censor all they want. They could decide what is allowed on their platform. But then they're also liable for everything that is posted on their platform. Given the fact that social media companies don't want that kind of liability, they should be considered common carriers. And the only thing they should be allowed to police or remove are those few narrowly tailored exceptions that the First Amendment does not apply to, right? The direct incitement to physical violence, the child pornography or other forms of obscenity. And Congress, I think it's time for Congress to recognize that what's called Section 230 liability immunity that they gave to the social media companies was well-meaning, but now these companies are so powerful and they have become de facto our new public square, such that deplatforming someone or shadow banning someone or kicking, removing a post from someone really is something that we should not give these companies the power to do. And I think ultimately that is the solution. This needs to become a campaign issue. This needs to become an issue that Americans basically say, we want the right to be able to speak freely and not be censored. And I think if enough Americans recognize that they have in fact been subject to censorship on social media, even if they don't realize that they have, the algorithm has dialed down the power of their voice if they said something that contradicted the government's preferred policies or the government's preferred narrative. I think Americans, when they experience this personally, rightly get upset. So it's time for us to recognize I've probably been harmed if I'm speaking on contested issues on social media. And even if I'm just going on social media to try to sort through contested issues, I've been harmed by one side of the debate being throttled down. And I don't want to live in a country where either large multinational corporations have the power to do that, or the federal government has the power to do that. Let's allow everyone to say their piece and let the chips fall where they may. That's the ultimate legislative solution, would be what's called a common carrier solution. So I think short term, Missouri v. Biden, we got to get a win at the Supreme Court. Following that, we've got to basically reconfigure the way in which these social media companies are situated so that they're treated as an internet service provider or as a cable company or as a public road would be treated as a common carrier.
Okay, I think these are the last two. Dr. Kheriaty, thank you for having moral principles and being courageous to stand up for them. Do you see the government workaround being to embed former Alphabet agency employees in these companies, people who will carry on the censorship because they are true believers?
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredible how many former members of the CIA work for Google and work for Twitter. I think a lot of the Twitter ones have been let go, though not all of them. So the intelligence community has always been interested in censorship. The CIA, from its very founding in 1947, following World War II, has always been interested in embedding its own people within journalism in order to shape public opinion according to its liking. This is not quote unquote conspiracy theory. This is well documented, and it's been well documented for decades. That didn't stop after the Cold War ended. And so, yes, that has been a tactic of the administrative state, particularly the intelligence and security apparatus of the administrative state, trying to basically influence private companies, private actors, journalists, media companies through embedding. I think true believers was a good way to put it, embedding people in there that had a particular ideological agenda and try to shape the company's policies in ways that will advance that agenda. So these things can be very subtle. Can we stop all of those forms of subtle information control and censorship? Probably not, but we can certainly put a halt to the most egregious and disgusting violations of the First Amendment. And, I think that's where we have to begin. You begin with the low-hanging fruit, not the really difficult workarounds. If they're going to do this, make it really, really hard to do. Don't make it such that, someone at the White House or Rob Flaherty at the White House can call up a senior executive at Twitter and browbeat this person into submission to remove specific posts that the President of the United States or the White House simply doesn't like. I mean, we had parody accounts removed, accounts, that were devoted to political satire removed. Mm-hmm. This is insane. This is completely bonkers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I think it's even crazier that there are still like a lot of people, including the ones that we were talking about when we started this in the corporate press, who like still think it's a good thing. I mean, that's it's one level of crazy that it's happening. It's another level of crazy that people applauding it. All right, Doug Ryland. So since the Biden administration has already appealed this, does Dr. Kheriaty believe they will obey the court, or will they just ignore it, like the Fifth Circuit Court's ruling on immigration law and recent Supreme Court ruling on student loans?
That's a great question. We've already seen, since the injunction was released, some government agencies canceling their routine meetings with social media companies. So they have started to change their behaviors. They have started to try to cover their tracks. CISA, the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, a little known federal agency that is kind of close to the center of the hub of this whole censorship enterprise, removed a lot of the information they had online about their engagement with social media companies. So we have seen a shift in the behavior on the part of some of these agencies. Excuse me. But there is a risk, especially given that, you think about the executive branch of government that we're suing is the branch of government responsible for enforcing the law, right? Congress makes the law, the courts interpret the law and apply the law to specific cases, and the executive branch enforces the law. Well, the Department of Justice is one of the defendants named in this lawsuit. So the whole question of how do you enforce the court's ruling is a really good question. Perhaps Congress will have to set up an independent investigator, or the court will have to order Congress to set up, some sort of mechanism to monitor this. I think for the injunction, while the case is still being tried, you will see that have an effect. Hopefully, the Fifth Circuit will uphold the injunction. And the reason that will have an effect is that basically, if they continue this behavior while the case is winding its way through the courts, everything they do, all of the written communications can be subpoenaed in our case and will add to the evidentiary record that this is happening, but also could implicate those individuals in terms of not just a civil violation of stepping over the First Amendment line, but a criminal violation of contempt of court. And this is something that I think, a federal judge is going to take very seriously. If his injunction is not being obeyed, he will not hesitate to call, to haul into court anyone who's clearly violating the injunction. So, then it's a question, if you're trying to do it sort of quietly, just phone calls rather than a written email that is going to be harder to subpoena. Well, how much do you trust that social media executive on the other end? The social media companies are feeling the heat too as well. And they're probably also starting to realize, if they read the injunction carefully, that they could be potentially implicated and liable if they don't push back, right? So is this person going to out me if I continue this behavior? I think is going to be in the back of the mind of a lot of federal officials. So there's no doubt in my mind that the federal officials now are running around trying to find workarounds and looking very, very carefully at the exceptions that were articulated by the court and seeing how broadly they can interpret or misinterpret those exceptions. So this industry is not going to fold up and go home overnight. They are going to try to find workarounds. But I think that a strong injunction like this is certainly a warning shot across the bow. And I think there's very few government officials that are prepared to continue engaging in this kind of behavior if it means they may individually actually be dragged into court and asked some pointed questions about why they are continuing to violate the injunction, which is very clear in terms of what it's allowing and what it's not allowing. So it's going to have an effect. After the final ruling, who continues to monitor that? That's going to be a hard problem. That's going to be a difficult question. And ultimately, Allison, I think we have to win in the court of public opinion as well. We have to get enough Americans to realize what's going on, to remember why the First Amendment exists to begin with, and why the arguments in favor of censorship are so weak and ultimately self-defeating. And if there's pushback from the public, that has an effect. I think it's naive to believe that the courts operate in complete isolation, right? They are, for better or worse, influenced by the court of public opinion and by the general mood of the country. And so I think the work that you're doing in media and communications to try to get the word out about what's happening is just as important as the arguments that we're making in court.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, we'll see. Like you said, it's and we talked about this earlier. It's I don't know what my husband would come up with a better analogy, like a self-wagging dog or whatever. It's a vicious cycle because he calls it a self-licking ice cream cone. That's what he says. He says Seattle is a self-licking ice cream cone. I don't even know what that means, but anyway, but I just think that it's just the information drives the culture war that drives the judicial system that drives the information war that drives the cultural, you know what I mean? So it's just this, like, people like me, we get banned. And so then folks go, that's not happening. You're like, well, yeah, it is. It's just, you didn't hear about it. You know, what's funny, I'm remembering now our whole connection. You came on my show to talk about your lawsuit for natural immunity. It got taken down off of YouTube. I went to Twitter, which is the only way to get things restored. If you have enough people that will go on Twitter, you know, and rage tweet YouTube. That's how my bosses at the Department of Natural Resources saw what I was, even though they knew I had a podcast, but they hadn't been keeping up with my content. Right. So they saw all these, you know, hundreds of retweets about Dr. Kheriaty, and they're like, what is Allison doing in her free time? You know, they go and they see, we can't have her doing that. So, you know, they're like, well, you can keep your job if you stop talking to people like him. Of course, they know. Then they actually keep their word, as the government rarely does. And they did keep their word in this case. They did fire me. The video gets restored after all that, you know, so the video's back on YouTube. But you could just see just in our own, just the two of us in our interaction, how many levels of pressure there is for people to stay silent. There's your job. There's the product itself that gets removed. There's the fact that, like, I don't like the fact that Twitter and rage tweeting is the only way to get your video restored, because that means that only people like me or you who have a lot of followers, or we have people who have a lot of followers, that's not fair. That doesn't protect the person with 56 followers. So I don't celebrate that. I mean, there's just so many layers to this onion. So I agree with you. It's just so difficult. But you know, one of the reasons that I'm still on YouTube, besides the fact that it's, you know, even though I really do believe I'm shadow banned and everything, I still come here because it's a bridge to the other side. And I guess I do have some hope maybe someday something changes. I don't know. I mean, if it took me a lot of extra effort to be here, I wouldn't do it. But, you know, I just click an extra button and my stream goes on YouTube. Big deal. But I do have a little bit of hope that someday maybe, you know, it'll be different. I don't know if you guys can hear the producers have hit their official wall. We're going to do bath time. It was so nice of them to stay up a little later on this Friday night. And instead of getting to watch lots of cool movies with popcorn and stuff like normal kids, they get to listen to Dr. Kheriaty and hear all kinds of crazy things about internet censorship. These kids, man, I'll tell you what, I don't know what they're going to turn into, but it'll be interesting. Any final words, Dr. Kheriaty, before we go?
The First Amendment exists not for the loud majority voices. It exists for the quiet minority voices. It exists for those who have less power. That was the whole purpose of the First Amendment. The majority loud mainstream voices don't need legal defense because no one's going to bat them down. So I really appreciate that last remark you made, that, you know, in a sense, you and I can get on there and make our case, and then, you know, get our followers riled up, and they can make the case and we can push back. But really, we have to fight for the person who doesn't have that in his or her corner. That's the whole purpose of the First Amendment, that every American is equal in regards to being able to voice an opinion. Every American's vote counts as one and only one, and every American's voice should count as a one and not a zero, or not be throttled down to as, you know, 0.5 because some algorithm or the government doesn't like their viewpoint. So this is important, not primarily to help people like you and me that have a microphone, but it's to help people that don't have so much of a microphone. And one of the beautiful things about the social media landscape, one of the early promises of it, was it could give every American a voice. And if a voice turned out to be compelling, it could rise up and grow in influence organically and naturally on the merits of its own insights, intelligence, arguments, logic, persuasiveness, what have you. That's the kind of world that I want to live in. I don't want to live in a kind of world where a few people, a few elites, amass all the power and decide what can and cannot be said. So we'll keep fighting. We have to.
Totally
I mean,
agree.
without free speech, the American experiment in ordered liberty, as Lincoln put it, is finished.
Yeah.
I mean, it can't exist.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, it's the foundation of it all, really. Because yeah, how do you have anything if you can't talk about it? I like Spindrift too, by the way. I drink that
Oh,
stuff.
thank
'cause
you.
It says,
Yeah,
it says it only
this
is
is non-alcoholic.
water.
I'm not digging into the Allison's wine quite yet.
Yet.
Maybe after I hang up.
Okay, Dr. Kheriaty, thank you so much. Thanks everybody for watching. Don't forget there are links in the description for how else you can support Dr. Kheriaty. One more time, tell people where they can follow you.
Follow me on Twitter at Kheriaty, Kheriaty. Follow me on Substack, aaronkheriaty.substack.com. And you can Google me and find lots that I've written on this topic in the last, particularly in the last few weeks.
Awesome. Okay, everybody. We'll see you next time. Thanks for watching.